And probably people got a message saying that something's going to be recorded. All right. Well, with that, Kurt, thank you again very much on behalf of UCGIS for providing this opportunity for our group. I will mute my own microphone and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, it's really nice to be here. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and normally I would start with a little about me. My company is Bird's Eye View GIS, and the URL is below. And so for the last 12 years, I've run this business out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I do a little bit of everything. I do some mostly consulting, but also quite a bit of training with people in recent years. And so spatial analysis, cartography, a little web mapping, kind of a jack of all trades. And I've based my business on open source from the outset. So I've been using QGIS since somewhere around 2005. But I'm not going to introduce my business anymore because I'm in a massive transition at the moment. I just accepted in October a new job for an open source geo company based in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I start February 1st. So we haven't made an official announcement yet, so I'm going to keep the identity of this company a secret for now. But needless to say, my life is in a little bit of a upheaval at the moment. My house has been sold. I am in it now, but I'm only in it for 2 more nights, and then we close on it early next week. So my whole life is, well, that's what my office that I worked out of for the last 12 years looks like now. And all my belongings are now just sitting in a stack of boxes, getting ready to be shipped to Denmark on Monday. So I'm working on a backup laptop. My whole office is packed away. So I'm not quite as prepared as I normally would be. But we're gonna, 90 minutes is fairly short for a QGIS workshop covering data visualization. There's a lot out there that we could cover. So we're going to kind of keep it fairly simple. If you do fall behind, this is being recorded. So you can always go back and watch and catch up, but certainly let me know if the pacing is too slow or too fast and we can adjust accordingly. And we'll take a 10-minute break about halfway through. So that's that. Part of introducing myself is always introducing books. I'm a QGIS author. So I have written several books on QGIS. The most recent one is QGIS for Hydrological Applications, Recipes for Catchment Hydrology and Water Management. And I co-wrote this with Hans van der Kwast, who's a big part of the QGIS community as well, based in the Netherlands. And so this is a book that goes through hydrological analyses and how to delineate watershed boundaries from a DEM, generate streams by Strahler order and things like that. But it also has a lot of data styling in it. That was my largest contribution to the book. And then on the right, Discover QGIS was published about almost a year and a half ago or so. And it's a 400-page workbook. So it's, as it says, it's a workbook for classroom or independent study. So I know we have a lot of educators on here. So this is a book that was designed for the classroom. So if you're thinking of adopting a course at your institution, this could be a nice jumpstart or supporting material for courses. It has 32 lab exercises, and it's a pretty thorough treatment of the broad capabilities within QGIS, from spatial analysis to cartography to data management, all those sorts of things. So today we're going to try to cover a variety of topics over the 90 minutes. We're going to start out here looking at live layer effects. We'll look at blending modes, and these are things that have been in QGIS for a long time. But people who are new to QGIS may not be, familiar with these. We're also going to do a nice little exercise mapping field photos where we can look at some of the other renderers available in QGIS. And that'll be a nice segue into looking at geometry generators, which is a really fascinating renderer in QGIS that allows you to transmute the geometry of features based on an expression. And the QGIS expression engine is incredibly powerful, so it's a really fascinating topic. We'll look at rendering some point data with some of the unique renderers around that. And then we'll finish up looking at the temporal controller, which is fairly new in QGIS, and working with mesh data in QGIS. And as part of, if we have time, I'll do a little bit of a demo on setting up custom legend patch shapes at the end. So we're going to be working with QGIS 316. So hopefully everyone has that installed. And I have provided the data folder. So hopefully you have that unzipped and ready to go and know where it is. Within that, there's going to be a series of subfolders by topic that we can work with. And we're going to start out with looking at live layer effects. This isn't the most, glorious map or anything, but I for years have worked with lots of conservation organizations in the American West. And they always seem to want maps that are just too complicated, polygons on top of polygons on top of polygons. And, sometimes from my perspective, it should be 2 or 3 maps instead of 1. But some of these features that we're going to talk about can help make a complicated map a little easier to look at and understand. So for example, this inverted polygon shape burst fill here, which is combining 2 renderers. QGIS has a renderer called inverted polygons, which, so if we had, the state of Colorado and we styled it with an inverted renderer, it would flip it so that the polygon is everything outside of Colorado. And you can use that renderer to create masks. So here we're using that tied with a shape burst fill to create that kind of faded effect with some transparency and create a nice mask layer around the study area. There's some blending modes here, and we'll talk about those in a minute. They allow you to blend layers on top of one another, and they can be quite a bit more powerful than using simple transparency. And live layer effects, it's the first thing we'll take a look at this afternoon. These allow you to add things like drop shadows, inner and outer glows, and other effects to your vector features. So in live layer effects that we'll start out with, I think I'll toggle out of this and bring up QGIS. So to get everyone oriented, we're going to be using, to back up in QGIS, just like any GIS, you can control symbology by getting to layer properties of a layer by right-clicking on it, going into properties, going to the symbology tab, and then changing the symbology as you want and clicking OK to change it. But what we're going to be working with more today is this layer styling panel. So in this layers panel, there's a little paintbrush tool icon on the left. If you hover over it, it says open the layer styling panel, or click F7 as the keyboard shortcut for that. And it'll open up this panel off to the right side of QGIS. And this gives you access to all the symbology options in QGIS, but also any changes you make are implemented immediately on the screen. So, we just have this red polygon here, and if I wanted to change the color, I can, click the fill color part of that and use the color wheel to change that on the screen immediately. And so this can be really useful for searching for that perfect color for a feature on a map. So we're going to be using this panel, and the panel lets you choose which layer you're going to be working with, and then access all the different renderers. There's the inverted polygons that I just mentioned. This is just styled with random default symbology, a simple fill with a fill color and a stroke color. And we're going to be working with the effects. So if you look down below here, there's this draw effects option in this panel. And if I check that, this little yellow star becomes activated. And if I click on that, the panel changes to this effects window. And so I can then from here change the effect to different kinds of things. So this is just the straight symbology, but I could click drop shadow and apply a drop shadow to this feature. And with any of these effects, you're going to have options down below for manipulating that, the the color of the drop shadow, the offset, how big the shadow extends from the feature. And all of these are customizable, including the direction of the shadow. And there's also outer glow is one that's commonly used. And you can set up an outer glow. The default color is white, and with my white background, you're not even seeing it. So, you could change the shadow to a different color, or the outer glow to a different color. And then you'll start to see that, especially if I make the spread of the shadow a little bigger. So that's quickly how to access all of these. And these are the four basic ones that are most often used: drop shadow, outer glow, inner shadow, inner glow. But down below, there's another drop down for different effect types. And you'll see there's blur, colorize. This will replace whichever one you've selected. So if I have inner glow up here and I change it to blur, then blur gets put in this short list of effects. So you can, and source is always going to be the original symbology. So you can actually, have turn off the original symbology and just have some of these effects there. So you can, play around with that and come up with interesting effects just with these. So I'm going to get back into the PowerPoint, and we're going to, let's see, yeah, here we go. We're going to start with a project that's in your folder. So you're going to open up QGIS, and you're going to go to Project Open, and you're going to open Live Layer Effects. So the Live Layer Effects is the folder that we're going to be working with, and inside that there's going to be a neon QGIS project file. So let me, sorry, there we go. So just in terms of not assuming people have used QGIS much, to access that, I can go to Project Open. Go into my data for this project. Go into Live Layer Effects, and I'll see the neon.qgz project and click Open. You may see a transformation. This is a relatively new feature in QGIS. QGIS uses for projections and coordinate system another open source project called Proj. And Proj handles transformations between different datums and coordinate reference systems. And so here it's just telling you that what transformation is going to be used. And for our purposes today, you can just take the default and click OK. And so when we open up this map, we have the United States as black with white outlines, and then a couple flight paths and a couple airports. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the styling panel and some of the renderers here and using Live Layer Effects to kind of make some neon cartography out of this. So we'll have a little bit of fun with this. So I'm going to give you some specific colors to use. I'm trying to figure out if it's going to be easier for me to use my PowerPoint or walk you through this. Let me start by walking you through this. Okay, so I hopefully everyone has the project open. And again, if it's going too fast or anything like that, or too slow, let me know. We can adjust. So what we're going to do is click this little paintbrush icon to open the layer styling panel, and it will usually open to the right. Also, another thing that I tell people, if you're new to QGIS, I have you're going to see a layer and a browser panel set up in QGIS, and when you first open it by default, a new installation, you may see your panels as the browser panel and the layers panel underneath. And just to backtrack, another way you can open these projects is from the browser panel. You can find your project data, and in QGIS, you can always right click on a folder and designate that as a favorite, add as favorite, and it makes it easier to find your data. And if you see a QGIS project file, you can just right click on it and open the project. So you can use the browser panel as another shortcut to open QGIS projects. Yeah, get that out of the way. Okay, so another way to manage your panels here is simply to dock them on top of one another. And you can do that by left clicking on the header for one of these, like just to the right of the words layer. And then I can move this panel around. And if I hover over my browser panel so that you get that kind of blue color and drop it, the two panels will be stacked on top of one another with tabs at the bottom. So like a lot of people, especially on a small laptop screen, find that a little easier to work with than separate panels. So we're going to change the symbology of the airports first. And I'm gonna, there we go. And so what we're going to do is open up the layer styling panel, and we want to make sure that airports is the target layer. So at the top, you'll see a little drop-down menu that lets you choose which layer you're going to be interacting with. And you can also change that just by highlighting different layers in the layers panel. So we're going to start with airports, and we're going to change the color. So we're going to select the SVG marker component here of the layer style. And we're going to change the fill color to 255-0255. So we're going to go down here to, if we do this, it gives you the interactive. If you click the little drop down, it'll give you an interactive menu, but we want to actually enter RGB values. So to do that, we're just going to left click on the fill color, and it will bring you to this panel that lets you specify hue, saturation, and value in RGB. And so again, all I have to do is left click on the white fill color, and it'll take me to that. And so at this point, I'm going to enter 255-0-255, and I get this hot pink color. Once I've entered that color, I can click the Go Back Blue button to return to the main layer styling options. And what I'm going to do is change the stroke width from no stroke to just a thin stroke, 0.2, so one up click. So we have a little bit of a black outline around our airport icons. And then we're going to increase the size. So right now the size of these SVG icons is 5 by 5, and I'm just going to change that to 10 by 10. So our icons are a little easier to see. And the last step is to go and give a live layer effect. So we're going to click on Draw Effects right here, click the little yellow star to open the effects window. And we're going to give these a drop shadow. And we'll just use the default drop shadow. And we won't see this really because we're looking at a black background. So it's not really going to be a noticeable difference for the time being, but it'll come into play later. So we can click Go Back once we've applied the drop shadow, and we are done with the airports. So next, I'm going to switch to the flight paths. So I'm going to switch the target of my styling panel to flights. And I'm going to give these the same color as my airports. And so I'm going to, again, click the simple line component of this. And now that I've already used that color once, I can click the drop down and you'll see a recent colors there. And I can choose that hot pink that I've already used for the airports here. just click on it. So it's a quick way to reuse that color. You can also right click here and copy colors. There's also a color picker that can be handy sometimes. And we're going to then just make the stroke width thicker. Instead of 0.26, I'm going to make this 1.26. And again, with any of these changes, you should see the change immediately on the map when you do that. So now we're going to do something that's really going to create more of the neon effect that we're going for here. We're going to, again, enable draw effects down below. Click on the star to bring up the effects properties panel. And this time we're going to use an outer glow. We'll check outer glow, and the default outer glow doesn't do much for us here, so we're going to change it. So down below, there's a couple options for the outer glow. There's the spread, the blur radius, the opacity, and below that, there's a choice of between single color and a color ramp. And we're going to use a color ramp here. So we're going to choose color ramp, and I'm going to click the drop down menu to the right of color ramp. And you'll see the color ramps that are the ones that ship with QGIS by default, but we're going to create a new color ramp. So I'm going to choose create new color ramp from the option below. And then it's going to ask me what type of color ramp I want. And I'm going to choose should be the default gradient. So I'm going to create a new gradient color ramp and click OK. And that'll bring up the window that lets you design your own color ramp. So for this, we're going to, for color number 1, that's going to be the color closest to the feature. So we're going to use that same hot pink that we made the flight path. So again, I can click this drop down arrow and it will still be in recent colors, and I can choose that for color 1. Color 2 is going to be black, like the state outlines. So I'm going to click the drop down, and I should find black in the standard colors. So we're going to basically be grading an outer glow that blends from the flight path color to the background of the states. Another option here, if you had a different color than pure black, you could go down from this menu and choose pick color and just click on one of these states to grab that color that way. So now that we've done that, we can click OK. And now we're going to adjust it. So right now the spread is 2 by default, and we're going to change that, increase it to 5. So we're going to give it a spread of 5. You could even go up 6, 7, 8 if you wanted to increase the spread. The blur radius controls the distance that the colors blend into one another. So we're going to increase the blur radius to 3. And you can also, play with opacity here. I'm just going to use the default for this, but we're starting to get a little bit more of that neon effect taking place here. And what we're going to do next is going to, we'll put it over the top a little bit. So we're going to click the back arrow once we've finished with this outer glow effect. And with any symbol in QGIS, we have just a simple line right now. And you'll see off to the right here, there is a little panel of buttons, and one is a green plus, and we can add symbols to the symbol stack for this layer. So we're going to click the green plus button to add another simple line to our symbol stack. So just pressing that creates a new simple line. It'll be a thin black line by default. And what we're going to do is change the color to a brighter pink. So again, I'm going to click the color bar down here, left click on it, and I'm going to use an RGB value instead. And I'm going to make this 255, 185, 255. So again, that's 255, 185, 255. And that is going to be a lighter pink. And once I've got that 255, 185, 255 entered, I can click the go back button. And I'm going to bump up the stroke width. I think it should be at 1 click to 0.46 to make it a little thicker. And that gives a little bit of that, bright color on top of the outer glow that really makes it look a little more neon. So how's the pacing? Everyone getting that to work?
Yeah, I think so. We've had a couple things in the chat, but I think it seems, yeah, looks
Okay, good. So that's one example of using live layer effects. They're often used to, lift features off a busy map. For example, you can use drop shadows and glows to allow things to, separate from a map visually a little bit. In this case, using an outer glow and grading it between the background color of the map and the color of the feature can often be a nice effect.
Kurt, what was the effect that the draw effect that you put on the airports?
Just a drop shadow, just a default drop shadow. Yeah.
Thanks.
And it's subtle, but you do see the airports lifting off the, being separated from the flight path once that's done. Okay, so let's move on to another use of these. So you can save this project if you'd like. I'm going to switch to my browser panel, which will still have that live layer effects folder open because that's the last place I was. And you'll see there's another QGIS project in there called Bathymetry. And we're going to look at another use of layer effects in this. So I'm going to right click on Bathymetry and open project. And while I'm here, you'll notice another new context menu that is in QGIS now is one for symbology. I could extract the symbols from that project into my symbol library. So we're not going to do that, but I just want to point that out since we're working on cartography and data visualization. So I'm just going to choose open project. I'm not going to save my edits to this one. And I get this new project opening up that is kind of zoomed into the North Atlantic basin. And we've got a series of bathymetric layers here that are from the natural Earth data set. And these are already pre-styled from light blue to dark blue, depending on the depth of the water at that point. So these are polygons. And we have a polygon land layer and then a shaded relief that we can't quite see yet. So we'll work with that. So for this, there's already been an effect applied to each one of these bathymetry layers. So what I'm going to have you do is simply select the bottom one, NE10M bathymetry L0, the very lowest one in the list. Select that so it's the target in your styling panel. And then I'm going to have you expand layer rendering. And when the layer rendering section has the opacity slider, this thing called blending mode, which we're going to look at next, and then draw effects. And all I want you to do is enable draw effects. So just click the draw effects button and then move on to the next layer, the one above that, the one that ends in 200. And again, expand layer rendering and enable draw effects. So again, the effect's already been done for you. You just have to enable it for all these layers. And pay careful attention to the map as you start enabling layer effects on each one of these bathymetry layers. And you'll see a really cool effect starting to happen. So this kind of gives an almost, woodcut kind of three-dimensionality effect to the depths of the ocean and the bathymetry. Anyone figure out what effect's being applied here? This is an inner shadow, and for this, it's almost the default inner shadow. I simply reduce the offset a little bit from like the default of 2 to 1. I reduce the blur radius a little bit and set the color to a kind of a medium gray instead of a black, I think, which is the default. So just made a couple tweaks to the basic inner shadow, and it creates this really interesting effect with this data. So of course, all of these are situation specific. You can do, but this is an interesting example of the inner shadow effect in play.
Kurt, would there have been a shortcut or a trick to making all of those selections at once, to picking them all at once and executing them?
Not that I'm aware of.
Across them all? Okay.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think you can, I don't think you can access the styling properties of multiple layers at a time. You could probably do that with PyQGIS, I'm sure, if you want to write a little script, but not by pointing and clicking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
So now we're going to segue into blending modes. So when you're done with this, make the land layer your target layer. And again, you're going to expand layer rendering. And one thing you could do if you wanted to kind of see the relief through the land layer is play with the opacity slider. And usually there's a sweet spot around 65% opacity where you're starting to be able to see some of that relief through the land layer. But this has some drawbacks, because if you want to see the relief, the shaded relief more and more, you make the opacity increasingly, increase the opacity, but the color starts to wash out until it's completely transparent. So a better approach to using opacity for that kind of effect is to use a blending mode. So for layer blending mode below, I'm going to have you set that to multiply. And multiply is probably the most commonly used blending mode. It's really useful for if you have a land ownership layer over shaded relief, you want to see all the colors in the land ownership or the land status and the relief at the same time. The multiply blending mode has the advantage of kind of maintaining the full saturation of whatever colors you're using while giving you all the detail of the shaded relief beneath it. So how are we doing? Anyone bored? What I'm about to do here, I'm going to show you an Easter egg. QGIS has some fun Easter eggs, and this is Friday afternoon. If you put your cursor in the coordinate box at the bottom of the QGIS window and erase the coordinates and type the word board, of course I have to spell it correctly, board, and hit enter, you will turn your map into a slide puzzle. So you could have fun with one of your colleagues someday.
That's excellent. Is it randomly sorted that way?
Yeah, it gets randomly sorted, but they all have little ID numbers on them, and so you could put it back.
That's pretty funny.
And then to get rid of that, you can just uncheck one of the layers and turn it back on, and it disappears.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
We have a question about the pros and cons of using blending modes versus simply changing the symbology of the relief raster?
I'm not, well, if you're trying to put a, blending is really useful for combining a polygon layer, which is on top of the relief, visually with the relief beneath it. You can certainly, create color shaded relief effects with a colored DEM and a hill shade layer beneath it. But even with that setup, it's you get usually a better effect with the blending mode than you would with any kind of other symbology effect that I'm aware of. Usually transparency is the one that you'd have to use, and layer blending is usually much more elegant. Let's see, so let me get back into here. There we go. While we're on the topic of Easter eggs, there's a whole assortment of these. So you could, if you have an empty QGIS project, you can just type the world keyword in the coordinate box and you get a map of the world. In this example, there's another one called contributors, user groups, and Hackfest. You can type all of those to see where in the world you get these layers popping up that shows where there are QGIS user groups, national QGIS user groups, where the contributors are located, where Hackfest has been held. We just covered board. There's a couple others, Dizzy and Retro, that are kind of crazy. So there are always a growing list of QGIS Easter eggs in there, and those are the main set that I know of. So we're going to look at blending modes a little bit more now. So these are modes that are, well defined and used in other software, such as graphics packages like Photoshop or GIMP or Illustrator or Inkscape. And QGIS has 13 blending modes within it. There are some explanations of these in the QGIS documentation. For example, multiply, the one we just used, the numbers for each pixel of the top item are multiplied with the corresponding pixel value for the bottom item, and the results in darker pictures. So there's several different families of blending modes here, and we're going to look at a couple more of these. So what I'm going to have you do next is open a new project, which is in the blending modes folder, and it's called Hamus. This is a mountain range a little north of me. A big volcanic caldera, looks pretty interesting on satellite imagery. It's a massive volcanic caldera, must be 10 miles across or something. So I'll open that up with you. If you get a transform message, just click the default OK. And in this project, we have a DEM and a rivers layer turned on. And what I'm going to have you do is right-click on the, make the DEM the target layer in your styling panel. And the DEM is using just the default DEM symbology on a white to black color ramp. But if we click where it says single band gray to see what the other options are, you'll see that there is a hill shade option. So we're going to choose hill shade. So we're going to render our DEM as a hill shade. So that's a nice renderer. You don't have to generate a hill shade specifically. You can just render your DEM as a hill shade. And I'll point out that there's also a contour renderer. So you could right click on this and duplicate this layer and style the duplicate as contours if you wanted to play with that. So now that we have a DEM, a hill shade layer and rivers, let's turn on the land ownership. And again, this is probably a real classic example of wanting to be able to see a combination of the land ownership with the relief. So in this map, the green is Forest Service, the kind of the purple color is Park Service, this orange is a tribal Pueblo reservation, some Department of Defense lands where Los Alamos is. So there are a lot of different colors going on here. And if I make the land ownership the target layer, and again, expand layer rendering, you know, I could go in and I could reduce the opacity like we did before. But in this case, it's even worse because we really start losing the saturation of those land ownership colors and using this method. So instead, we're going to use the same one we just used. We're going to change the feature blending mode to multiply. And you know, so you can see that we get a very nice rendering of both the terrain and the colors in this case. So next, let's go ahead and turn on the PLSS townships. So these are the township range and section, the townships for the PLSS in the Jemez area. And let's select the simple fill option, and let's make the stroke width a little thicker so that we can see these a little better. Make it maybe 0.66, 0.86, 2 or 3 clicks up in width, so that we're seeing the black townships a little more clearly. And another interesting blending mode that we could use is overlay. So we could expand layer rendering and use a layer blending mode of overlay. And that, in this case, makes the townships still visible, but they tend to take on a darker, more saturated color of whatever land ownership color they're running through. So they don't dominate the map, but the information is still there. So that's another nice effect. And blending modes in QGIS aren't just for layers, they're also available in print layouts. So we could go to the project menu. There's a print layout started in here. And to access that, you can go to the project menu. And if you go down to layouts, you'll see that there's an existing one called blending modes. And we're going to open that up. So just a basic print composition here. But you'll see this made with QGIS logo. And this goes for my bird's eye view logo too. If we want, in this case, the white to be stripped off the logo, we select the logo itself and switch to the item properties tab off to the right. And item properties, since we have the logo selected, is going to be properties of that image, of that graphic. So in a print composition, item properties will change to whichever object you have selected. If I was to select the legend, that would be properties of the legend. So we're looking at properties of this made with QGIS logo, and you'll see that there's a rendering section there. And if we expand rendering, there's a blending mode option. And if you use that same multiply blending mode we used for the land ownership, it will strip out the white around that logo. And I use that with my bird's eye view logo, which has a white collar around it. And instead of having to go into Photoshop or GIMP and make a version that has a transparent background and one that's white and things like that, I can just use a blending mode to quickly strip that white out. And you could experiment with some of the other blending modes in here too. There's some, you know, if you use soft light, for example, kind of creates an interesting effect. So this is kind of just a little sandbox you can play around with. And any object in this print composition is going to have that option. So the legend, for example, also has a rendering section. I don't often find this useful, but you can apply blending modes to legends as well as logos and other things. So those are a couple of use cases of blending modes. And let's now, before we take a break, switch off to looking at the feature blending mode.
Are these it seems like when you go into item properties of many things, they have the options under like the layer rendering options are there. Is that hold true for labels?
Labels are part of the properties of the actual layer.
Okay.
But blending modes are available for those too. So for example, if we
Okay,
wanted
yeah.
to label townships in the layer styling panel, we've been working on the top tab of the layer styling panel, and the one just below it is for labels.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where you control your labels. And I can't remember if this has a nice category that has both the township and range, but if I just turned on the township, use it labeling by the township column. So here, there's also these tabs across here are different things you can do with labels, and there's quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But you can enable a drop shadow, and there's also if you apply things like a halo or a text buffer, you can apply blending modes to those. So I just added a white halo around my labels, and you can come up with some nice effects by experimenting with some of these on different maps. Some of these will, combined with opacity, make the halo effective without dominating the map.
Right.
So I kind of just encourage people to experiment with some of these with labels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nice.
But one interesting thing that people often overlook is, let me refresh this. So I've got my big ugly labels on my map now. And so this label is being cut off by my legend. And so if I select my map so that I'm looking at item properties for my map, there's a little label button at the very top right of item properties here. And if I select that, I can tell QGIS which map objects I want to be label blocking items. So for example, if I want to avoid labeling conflicts between my map and my legend, or my map and my logo, see, I've got labels on top of my logo up here. I could select that picture as being label blocking. And so now it tells QGIS not to place labels where that logo is. And I could do the same for the legend. And so this is a really nice feature. If I if I'm working on my map and I move this logo around, the labels are going to move to get out of its way.
Yeah, it looks much better than having the label truncated there.
Right.
Kurt, we have a question about putting a box behind the labels. Do you want to just show that really quick with the background tab?
Sure.
On the labeling?
So the tab looks like a highway shield, this background, and you can use that to create different shapes behind the label. So the default here is a rectangle, and you can have different options for fixed size or a buffer. So I could tell QGIS how much of a buffer to create around these in the X and Y direction. And there's other shapes in here. So squares, ellipses, circles. If you have the actual highway shields, you would choose SVG and choose the highway shield SVG to actually put the interstate number onto, and marker symbols. So you have quite a few choices there, and then lots of settings for how to configure those, including blending modes and opacity that we've been working with, and draw effects as well. So you could even put drop shadows behind those. So yeah, there's a lot of options with labeling. Even a fairly new one called callouts, where you can have, we're not really getting into automatic or manually placing labels, but you can use that to have a label that has a long name for a small polygon. You can pull it outside the polygon and have the little line pointing to the feature it's labeling. So let's finish with one other interesting thing, but any other questions before we move on to the next map?
Nope, I think we're caught up.
Okay, good. Those are good questions. We're going to finish up blending modes by opening the other project in that folder called DK Roads. Again, take the default transformation settings. So this is actually a map that I, from a workshop I taught in Denmark the first time I was there. This is going to be my new hometown here. This is the island of Zealand, where Copenhagen is located. Copenhagen is right here, and this is Sweden off to the east. And so we're looking at a map with a dark background, black countries, and these blue roads. So what we're going to do is, again, expand layer rendering. And instead of working with layer rendering, we're going to work with feature rendering, or feature blending. I'm sorry. Instead of layer blending, feature blending. And here we have OpenStreetMap roads. And for the urban area of Copenhagen, we're getting so many line symbols, stacked on top of one another, that they're stacked, they're obliterating each other. And one thing we can do to kind of represent road density, if you will, is change the feature blending mode to addition. And what that's going to do is mathematically add all those blues together wherever there are overlapping lines. And so the more overlapping lines you get, it becomes 255 to 55 to 55, which is white. And so it starts adding those together and creates this effect, which is definitely dependent on your zoom level. If I zoom into Copenhagen, I'm going to get fewer stacked lines, and so the effect changes a little bit. But that's another use case for blending modes, and kind of shows you how the feature blending mode itself works. It works on a feature by feature basis for whatever effect you chose. And so addition works really well to create this kind of density map, especially if you're working with a dark background in this case. Any questions on that?
No, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's fun.
That's really neat.
So we're at the top of the hour. Let's go ahead and take a quick 5-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to, let's see, maybe we'll play with the temporal controller.
Sounds good. Thanks,
come back
Kurt.
at 5 after.
Yep, I'll pause the recording while we're on our break.
Great. Addition on to those Denmark roads in the layer blending mode, not much would happen, but if we do it at the feature blending mode, you're applying that blending mode on a feature by feature basis. When you have like maybe 10 roads stacked on top of one another, you're blending all of those together with that addition mode, and which adds the pixel values of all the colors together. So hopefully that makes sense.
So the feature,
is there documentation that talks about the algorithms behind these things?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
In fact, and at the end of this, I'm going to share my PowerPoint, because there'll be other stuff we're not going to get through that I want to share with you. And I do have a slide on there. It is in the QGIS documentation. They have a piece, and I have a slide in here that explains what each blending mode does.
Great.
Yep. So let's start this second half with geometry generators. So I'm going to have everyone open a new project. It's going to be in the folder called Geometry Generators, and it's the Geometry Generators project. And it's going to be just a map of, these are big game hunt units for the state of Colorado. It's how Colorado manages their big game hunts. And we have black fills with white outlines. So what we're going to do is duplicate this layer. So we're going to right click on the big game hunting layer and choose duplicate from the context menu. And it's going to create a copy of that layer that's turned off. I'm going to drag that layer to be in the top position. So the copy is on top, and I'm going to turn it on. You can left click on layers in the layers panel and move them vertically up and down in the layer stack. Sometimes it's easier to move the top one underneath. You know, it kind of depends on your mouse control on the machine you're working on. So we're going to make this copy the target layer in the styling panel. And we're going to choose the simple fill component. And again, when we do that, that's when we get access to the fill color and the stroke color and the width and all of that. And you'll see down below, there's this thing that says symbol layer type simple fill. And if we click that drop down menu where it says simple fill for symbol layer type, you're going to see a whole batch of what I end up calling sub renderers. So, you know, we're using a single symbol, and then you can combine single symbol with any of these. And what we're going to choose is the one second from the top called Geometry Generator. So when we do that, we get this window below that allows us to choose the geometry type. So we have polygons here, but we're going to change this to point, multi-point. And below that, you see this dollar geometry. That's the geometry for every feature in our hunting units layer. And what we're going to do is click the little expression button off to the right to bring up the expression window. And I'm going to have you search for centroid. One of the nice things in QGIS is that I think pretty much every single dialog, including layer properties and project properties, have little search boxes so you can filter the contents of that by your search term. So I find the function called centroid, and it returns the geometric center of a geometry. And so here's the syntax, centroid around, you know, being fed one parameter of the geometry. So I'm going to put my cursor right in front of the dollar sign in front of geometry and double click this function to add it to my expression. I get a little red flag here indicating that there's something wrong with my expression. It needs a closing parenthesis in this case. I'm going to hit the closing parenthesis after the Y in geometry. And you'll see down at the bottom that the preview is telling you geometry point. So go ahead and click OK for that. And you will see QGIS can render this polygon as centroids. And it's very fast. You know, well, one little thing about centroids, there's like a strange shaped game management unit in the middle here, and centroids can actually, in that case, be outside the bounds of the feature. So there are other geometric functions that we could use to achieve a similar but better effect. I'm clicking the expression button again and going back into my expression, and that was the centroid function was found in the geometry section here. And you'll see there's a long list of geometric functions in QGIS. And one that would work better, pole of inaccessibility. So instead of centroid, I'm going to try pole of inaccessibility. And for any of these, you'll see the syntax to the right. This needs the geometry and a tolerance separated by a comma. So I'm going to put a tolerance of 1 in. So I have pole of inaccessibility, inside the parentheses, geometry, $geometry, comma 1. And I'll click OK. And now you'll see that it's going to compute the most internal point for each polygon. So for that strange U-shaped one, the points falling within. So there's a lot of functions in there that you can use. And so this is a very unique renderer because it renders the data based on your expression, and you can use that whole slew of geometric functions to do this. So let's try one more example. We'll right click on the original big game hunting units and duplicate it again to create a second copy. And we'll put that copy in between the first two, in between the point and the original. And we're again going to select simple fill for this second copy. And we're going to use the geometry generator symbol layer type again. But this time we'll choose Polygon. And if I know the function that I want to enter, I can just type it into this box where $geometry is sitting. So we're going to use, we're going to create a negative buffer. So the function is simply buffer, B-U-F-F-E-R, in front of $geometry. Put an opening parenthesis. And buffer just gets one additional parameter, the buffer distance. So if we enter a negative buffer distance, it'll create an internal buffer. So I'm going to hit a comma after geometry and enter -4,000. That'll create a negative buffer of -4,000 around for each polygon. And instead of it being black, I'm going to select this simple fill component, and I'll make it something that stands out a little bit better. It's maybe a light blue. So now I'm rendering these units as internal buffers. This one takes a little longer to compute. So those are two very simple and quick examples, but there's a lot you can do with these. So what I have up on my slide now is this thing called Tanaka contours, which a Japanese cartographer came up in the 50s for creating this kind of stepped illuminated contour rendering of terrain. This is an effect you can do simply with geometry generators. And I want to just run through some examples now that you've done a little bit. So this was from earlier this year. Scott Reinhardt is someone I follow on Twitter, and he said, I made these arrows solely with the QGIS functionality. 3 cheers for the geometry generator. From the New York Times, where New Yorkers moved to escape coronavirus. So this is early in the pandemic, and he made this rendering using geometry generators to connect people's home residence to where they'd moved to escape the pandemic. And I'm going to share some links here. I can put these into the chat, and also just, again, I'll be sharing this PowerPoint presentation. This gentleman, Michael Stutz, has a GitLab repository with all kinds of geometry generator examples that you can use. These can get really involved. So these are points as buildings. Just some really cool stuff. So you can go nuts with this. And here's showing points as tables, attribute tables. Another good source of some inspiration for these is this gentleman, Johannes Kroger. He has a blog called Hans Enjoys It. And if anyone knows the old Joy Division map cover, it's possible to create this kind of Joy Division look from terrain with geometry generators. And below that is a Lego rendering of terrain with geometry generators. So you can have some fun with that. And Topi Tukhanov has another GitHub repository with some of his symbols out there. Some of these involve geometry generators like this Q-limped rendering. Supposed to render geometries kind of like the artist Gustav Klimt. So some really creative stuff out there that maybe you can play with over the holidays. And one thing I want to mention too, since we're talking about symbology, is there's and this is kind of the way QGIS works. Someone comes up with an interesting idea and the next day it comes to fruition, it seems like. So someone on Twitter had an idea about a QGIS style repository a month or 6 weeks or so ago. So someone made it happen, and there's now an online repository where people have uploaded, or you can upload interesting styles that you've come up with. So you might want to explore that. It's kind of growing all the time now. So how are we doing on time? I think what we're going to do, we're going to finish with something fun. I think we have enough time to pull this off. We're going to play with some mesh data. Yeah, I think the fastest way will be for me to walk you through this. So let's see. Yeah, let's just start a new QGIS project. So let me find my cursor. So we're going to just click the little white piece of paper underneath project to start a brand new QGIS project. And you can either save or discard your previous edits to that one, the Colorado one. Now I'm going to go to the browser. And let's see, the best way to do this. So this series of buttons is how to add different data sets to your project. And so QGIS has this data source manager. And so we're going to click this little button with the blue, yellow, and red squares on it to open the data source manager. So you can drag and drop from the browser panel, but this lets you also access database connections, vector tiles, ArcGIS map services, and things like that as well. And what we're going to select from this is the tab called Mesh. And we're then going to click the Browse button for this Mesh data set. And let's see, it's going to be in the Mesh folder. So in the data that I provided, you should have a Mesh folder. And the data set we're going to add is this one called Atlantic_September 2017.nc. Atlantic September 27 NC. So once you have that selected, you click Open. And then click the Add button back at the Data Source Manager. And this may take a few moments to load. When it's loaded, you can click the Close button to close the Data Source Manager. So this is a data set that covers the Atlantic Basin during the entire month of September 2017. So it has a temporal component. And you'll notice when it comes in that there's a little clock icon next to the layer and indicating that it's a temporal layer. So QGIS already knows the fact that this is a temporal layer. The question mark next to that is for some reason, the coordinate system didn't come in with this. That shouldn't matter for what we're going to do. This is in geographic, EPSG 4326, but we can leave that alone for this little short demo. So this mesh data is kind of like a hybrid format between vector and raster is kind of how I think of it. It has a raster component with what you're seeing here. It also has kind of a vector component, which in this case, we can show the wind as arrows or streamlines. So you'll see that in the layer styling panel, mesh data has some different tabs than we've seen so far. And this data set is, really involved. It has a wind component, a temperature component, a precipitation component, and we know that it's temporally aware and it has 30 days of data in it too, because QGIS tells you right here that it's temporally aware, and I'm telling you it has 30 days of data. So what we want to do is first start with what they call the contour. So we're going to switch to the second tab that has the little rainbow square. And this is where we can set up the look of the base map there. So it's using this default color ramp. And what we're going to do is change that out to one that's red, yellow, blue. So I'm going to click the drop down to the right of color ramp. And then I'm going to choose the option all color ramps and go down and find red, yellow, blue. RDYLBU. That makes it mostly red. So I'm going to right click on the color ramp, and that gives you the option to invert. So we can flip the color ramp around. So we get the high wind areas will be highlighted in reds. We're also going to set the max value here from 34 to 25 to change the stretch of the data to highlight the higher winds a little bit more. So next what we're going to do, so that's it for that. And now we're going to work with what's called contours or the vectors rather. So we're going to switch back to this first tab that has the hammer and screwdriver on it. And you'll see that contours are activated for the wind, 10-meter wind. And there's a little black arrow off to the right of 10-meter wind. So we're going to click on that little black arrow, or it's a gray arrow. We're going to click on it. It'll kind of turn black and turn on the contours, and they're going to overwhelm the map for a little bit. So I've checked that little arrow, and now we're going to switch to the vector tab with the arrow on it. And we're going to do some things to make this a little easier to look at. So yeah, so this section that says display on user grid, we're going to choose that option. And we're going to change the spacing for these arrows to 15 by 15 pixels. So activate display on user grid and change the X and Y spacing to 15 each. That'll make them a little, sparser so that we can see them. Down below, there's an option for arrow length, and we're going to change that from this default setting to scaled to magnitude. You have a couple choices down there. We're choosing the middle one, scaled to magnitude. And instead of the scale factor being 10, we're going to change it to 1. And then finally, for the styling of these, we're going to use the color picker to just choose a dark blue off of the map. So instead of this black color for the arrows, I'm going to click the drop down arrow and choose pick color from the context menu. And then I'm just going to find a dark blue section of the map, like South America here, perhaps. So the arrows are a dark blue and blend into the rest of the map a little bit. And now what we're going to do is activate the temporal controller. So all the buttons across the top of QGIS, you'll see the pan and zoom buttons. And if you scroll to the right, there's one that looks like identify features, which is exactly what that is. There's a refresh button, and you'll see one with a clock on it. That's the temporal controller panel. So you're going to click on that to activate the temporal controller. And it opens up a panel across the top of QGIS. And we're going to select the second button there that says fixed range temporal navigation. And we do that. You can see the range goes from September 1st to September 30th. That's perfect. That's what we want. And then we're going to check the right button, animated temporal navigation. And from here, you can start using the slider or stepping through time. But we probably want to set we can set a different step over here. So it's going to step through in 6-hour chunks now. We could have it step through in 1 day if we wanted to. So you can change the step. And you can use the slider to start sliding through time. And you'll start seeing some interesting time. So I think it's the September, this is going to give you your current time. And September 6th is, you'll start seeing some of these larger hurricanes building. There we go. Yeah, so when we get to around September 6th, you're starting to see Hurricane Irma at a Category 5. If you go out to September 18th, you're going to see Hurricane Maria as a Category 5. So this is that month where we had all these Category 5 hurricanes blow through the Caribbean. And you can also zoom in to get a better look at some of the Caribbean islands. And I know I'm going fast at this point because we're running out of time. But there's also in that same mesh folder a countries layer. So if I go to my browser panel, there's a countries shapefile that I can add to my map. So I can actually see what these places are. Just give that a fill of no brush so I can see it. So that this is the temporal controller, and there's a lot you can do with it. I'm going to give you my PowerPoint this afternoon. I'll give you a couple links in there to some online YouTube videos and using the temporal controller. And actually Keith Jenkins on the call has done some really interesting things with it. But this is a very quick introduction to both mesh data and the temporal controller. Off to the right, there's a little save button, and you can use that to export this animation into individual scenes and then stitch those together into an animated GIF. And so I'll kind of show you what that can look like here as we close out. Here's my... There we go.
Kurt, I just shared with everyone in the chat space the link to the COVID animation blog posting you'd done.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, that was a really helpful one. I had students learn things about the temporal controller following that blog posting.
Oh yeah, so here's an animation that I made from this data that you're playing with. Which reminds me, I forgot one very cool thing to show you with that is that if I go back to this layer styling panel for the vectors, we're using the default arrow rendering of it, but there's also streamlines and traces. And the traces in particular, I find mesmerizing. So that's a look at what the traces can look like. So I encourage you to play around with the traces and the streamlines. Streamlines can take a little tweaking. They can get a little overwhelming. Traces are a little easier to work with most of the time, quickly. So yeah, so that's a quick and dirty introduction to both mesh data and the temporal controller. Yeah, I know it went by fast, but hopefully this was a helpful workshop for everyone. And I should mention that there is in terms of getting this kind of data, there's at least one plugin, the QGIS downloader, that lets you download weather data. which comes in this mesh format. So you could download weather data for your current map extent. So you could download it for your local area and play with this a little bit. There may be more, but there's a lot you can do with that, both with the mesh data and the temporal controller. Mesh data is also supported in the print composer. It can also be brought into 3D, which we didn't have time to play with, but there is a 3D map views that you can work with in QGIS. So we've just begun to scratch the surface, honestly, of the symbology options in QGIS.
They really are tremendous. It seems like this is where the user community, in one way that the user community has really done some excellent work.
Yeah, I totally agree. And every release of QGIS, it gets better and better and better. There's been a lot of work done around print composer enhancements in recent releases. There's going to be point clouds are going to be natively supported in QGIS in the next release.
Right. That the temporal controller was only built into the core, I think, in 3.1.4. So it's
Correct.
really, it's only just a few months ago that was part of the core part. Well, thank you so much, Kurt, for this. We really appreciate it. I think that there've been a lot of learning going on at different levels here, and I'm excited that we can share this with the community. Thank you, and especially we are very grateful for you taking the time to follow through with this workshop when you are just a few days away from moving to a different country.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm off to the dump to throw a bunch of stuff away.
May your temporal controller activities and your generating geometries work well to get you over to Denmark.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks everyone very much for your attention. Pay attention, there'll be other workshops on the UCGIS calendar that are announced for the spring semester. In the meanwhile, I will be sharing the link to this, in the next day or so. We'll get it processed, and meanwhile, be well and take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kurt.
All right.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
So long.
Thank
Thanks, Kurt.
you.